All right. Hello, everybody. I think we're about ready to go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will be coming in and going as this goes on. But yeah. So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming to this. In case you are just to make sure you're on the right Zoom call, this is the Philly DSA Policy and Organizing Training. I am Jonah. I'm the chair of the Philly DSA Canvassing Committee. And we have put this training on in collaboration with the Policy Committee of Philly DSA, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. This training's gone through a lot of different iterations as the politics has taken a lot of dramatic turns over the last 5 or 6 months. The reason we're doing this is that this is a very strange time to be a socialist and be trying to do organizing work. On the one hand, we just suffered a big loss in terms of the presidential race. Bernie Sanders has dropped out. He was defeated by Joe Biden. Obviously, that is a huge bummer and a huge setback for all of us. But at the same time, I think that conditions and the way kind of things have happened since then have shown that our work is more vital than ever. The coronavirus pandemic is leaving millions without jobs, millions uninsured because their insurance is tied to their employment. It is revealing or exposing these huge gaps in our society that just leave normal, average working people like you and me, completely unprotected. In a society that is unable and unwilling to, look out for average people during a time like this, while sending, trillions of dollars to big corporations and to billionaires. I just saw today Jeff Bezos is on track to become a trillionaire. The 50, however many billionaires have made over like $200 billion off of this or something like that. Incredible wealth is flowing upward during this crisis, and meanwhile we're staring down the barrel of massive unemployment, massive uninsurance. So, which is to say that our work is more important than ever, and there's still a lot of ways to get involved. There's still a lot of stuff for us to do, and there's still a lot of things that we as socialists should be engaging on, both in this coronavirus fight, in the upcoming primary election here in Pennsylvania, and going forward into the future. So the way this is going to work is we will have a brief presentation by the policy committee led by Jason and Khalil. They're going to explain why we as socialists should be fighting for power at the state level, at the state legislative power level, why these are important fights, what someone could accomplish in a state house or state senate. And the reason we're doing that is that in 2 weeks here in Philly, we're going to have a primary, and Philly DSA has endorsed 3 fantastic candidates for State House and State Senate. Then the canvassing committee is going to come on and explain how to have an organizing conversation over the phone. So right now we can't do the kind of door-to-door canvassing that, as socialists, I think that we all have gotten used to, or that we would all like to be doing right now. But there are still opportunities for us to organize around demands and to push for socialist changes through phone banking. So we're going to explain some of the principles of that, how to do that. And then we'll have a couple activities along the way, a couple ways for y'all to get involved and participate. So with that in mind, I think we're going to start things off by splitting up into some small breakout groups and just doing some brief introductions. Each breakout group will have a leader from the committee who will kind of help guide you through that. That'll take about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back here and start the policy portion of the presentation. So once again, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for taking time out to come and do this, and we hope you learned something from this. Okay, then if everybody is back, we're going to turn it over to the policy committee, who is going to do the policy portion of the training. So Jason, if you want to start it off.
Thanks, Jonah. I'm going to share my screen, so just give me 1 second. All right, can everybody see this? Thumbs up from 1 or 2 people, maybe? Okay, great. I'm the chair of the policy committee, and another member of the committee, Khalil, and I are going to present for the next 20 to 25 minutes. Initially, we were doing this with the canvassing committee around the Bernie Sanders campaign, so we were talking a lot about Bernie's platform and all of the planks in it and comparing it to other candidates. Now that he's dropped out, we've shifted more to talking about what's going on at the state level in Harrisburg, here in Pennsylvania, and also more generally why we should be somewhat interested in state politics in addition to the federal level. So the structure is in 2 parts. I'm going to go through some basic policy analysis. We can consider this maybe like policy analysis 101. And then Khalil is going to talk in more detail about Rick and Nikhil's specific policy platforms. So I'm going to go through the analysis for about 10 minutes and then throw it to Nikhil for about 10 minutes. All right, so in this section, the analysis section, I want us to talk a lot about sort of the concepts that are helpful when we're analyzing any particular policy. And I also want us to take away from this the ability to find patterns whenever we're looking at somebody's policy. This is important for any candidate, not just for Bernie, not just for Rick, not just for Nikhil, but when you read anybody's issue section on their campaign website, you should be able to sort of like look for particular patterns or things that they're advocating or more general concepts that they're pulling from. And that'll help make judgments and help us figure out with any candidate, not just candidates who are currently running, but with any candidate to sort of determine where they lie, what their ideology is, and make a judgment of whether it sort of aligns with your own ideology or is close to it, or whether maybe someone's a political enemy. All right. So the first concept I'm going to talk about is devolution. And this is a sort of silly term that policy wonks use to talk about power. So first, I'm going to do some very basic high school civics, and I want us to keep in mind 3 times 3, right? So we have 3 branches of government. These are the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. You should remember this from high school, hopefully. We also have 3 levels of government. We have the federal, the state, and what I'll call the local or the county or the municipal. We can see they're generally sort of lumped together, even though there are technical differences between them, but federal, state, and local or municipal. So what this means is that all 3 branches exist at all 3 levels in almost every case in the US. We have the federal legislative branch of Congress and the presidency and the Supreme Court and a bunch of federal courts, and that is imitated at the state and the municipal levels. Okay, so devolution is about the power that we see between the different levels. It is specifically a transfer of power from a higher level to a lower level. Historically, socialists have fought for power on all 3 levels and in all 3 branches, but with particular focus on the national legislative branch. The Bernie campaign obviously was a focus on the executive branch, and there were some advantages of focusing on that branch and disadvantages. But when we talk about the national legislative branch, we see many instances of devolution. And when we talk about the national executive branch, we also see instances of devolution. Instances where an agency or the legislature transfers power to a lower level. An important thing to note here is that whatever the higher power is has to have the right to do something when they transfer that power. So for instance, the US Department of Education holds the right to sort of disperse certain funds, right? They have certain grant programs, but they can transfer the power of administration of those funds, or they can transfer the power to change the eligibility for those funds to the state level. And that would rest either with the state legislative branch or the state executive branch, like the Secretary of Education at the state level. And the example I brought up sort of mixes a bunch of what's going on here. We talk about devolution in terms of legislation, rulemaking, and administration. Those are all different types of devolution. You can devolve your legislative power, right? Your ability to legislate a certain law. You can say, we're going to state X, but we're going to legislate X, but a state has the right to make it X prime, to change it in certain ways. You can do the same thing with rules, which are made by agencies, bodies in the executive branch. They do this sort of like more obtuse, more expert-based rulemaking, similar to legislation, but technically different. And these rules can then be tweaked at the state or local level if that power is devolved. And then we see the same thing with administration. So a great example of this is Medicaid. Medicaid funding comes entirely from the federal government. But the administration of Medicaid, the way that people fill out applications, where they go to get their Medicaid benefits, who sends cards, if they do send cards, is all administered through the state. And even in some cases, like in Pennsylvania, this administration is further devolved to the county. There are particular types of administration that the state does, and then particular types that they've decided are not worth their while and have devolved to the county level. So for instance, if you apply for Medicaid in Pennsylvania, you fill out an application on a state website, and then your application gets processed by a county office. And whenever you have to change anything or you have questions, you're calling a county office. All right, I hope that clarifies it. I want to talk a little bit about why devolution is bad politically. One reason that personally, as part of my politics, I dislike it is that devolution is a way to sort of, when you transfer power, you also sort of lose the accountability for holding that power. So you can sort of muddy the waters as to who's actually managing these things. And a good example of that is Medicaid, where as someone who receives Medicaid, I might not know exactly where to go if I need to advocate for my rights in the political realm. There's also sort of a spicy take I have on this, which is that devolution is just more of a modern form of states' rights, advocating for the states to hold certain powers and to use them when the federal government sort of abdicates the responsibility to the states. And then states can be very aggressive about keeping this power. And of course, we see the advocacy for states' rights take a very hard right turn throughout the 19th century. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is state action. And I don't mean just the state in the sort of like generic government definition, but specifically US states, right? What's happening in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot of frustration with Harrisburg, and I think it's well-deserved. Harrisburg has generally shifted to being sort of a madhouse and not doing very much, not helping a lot of constituents. We see a graph here of the number of legislative bills going down with the number of resolutions, which are just sort of toothless mandates going up. But the state government, and particularly Harrisburg, has a lot of say over funds, over funding, over the money that is used for all social services and public goods that we care about. States can also do some interesting things where they create their own institutions and they pass legislation that is only done at the state level. In part, this is because of devolution, but it's also because of sort of like constitutional mandates over who can do what. So a great example is that many states and cities have pension systems, which are almost uniformly run at the state or municipal level. There are some federal pensions, but they're mostly for federal workers. In terms of here in Pennsylvania, the public school employees retirement system, which is run here in Pennsylvania, is incredibly important for public sector workers who work in public schools and similar agencies that manage the pension funds of other public employees are are very important, and these are overseen largely by the legislature, but the legislature has also transferred some power to governing boards of these pension funds. So there are interesting conflicts that happen between some of the agencies that a legislature will create and the legislature that initially held the power to do that. We can also see some historical instances where these things get really messy. The 1970s fiscal crisis in New York City is a great example of that. So continuing to talk about funding, the state budget is a huge political debate every year. It usually happens over the summer. Our fiscal year starts July 1st, and the legislature is obligated to pass a budget by June 30th to take effect July 1st. Typically, the governor makes a proposal, and the governor sort of states what he wants to increase or decrease. And then there's a long negotiation process with both parties in the legislature over, basically every line item in the budget. So it's an extremely long, tense, and political process. One of the biggest sort of footballs that gets kicked around, especially in the last 10, 15 years, is about education funding. And we can see here for school districts across the state that many of them have sort of propped up their own taxation to fund locally, but still require a large chunk of their funding to come from the state level. We also, some people might be familiar with this already, but we have a very large disproportion between rich school districts and poor school districts defined more by property taxes and income. We see a lot of disproportionality between those districts and a wide gulf between those districts. And we actually have the worst sort of division between rich districts and poor districts of any state in the country, as evidenced in this graph. And this is partly because of the state's sort of inability to keep up education funding, and for particular legislatures to really make hay over the budget and end up cutting education funds, or just keeping them stable, which over time means effective cuts for school districts. The next thing I want to talk about is preemption. So this is a term some people might be familiar with, but a state can preempt a municipality from doing something. I show Martina White here because she's the chair of the subcommittee on urban affairs, which has significant power over a particular type of municipality, which has over 1 million residents. The only municipality in Pennsylvania that has over 1 million residents is Philadelphia. So she basically is in charge of preempting a lot of what Philadelphia does. And we can see in this analysis I have on the right of preemption laws across the country, a number of states have passed all sorts of preemption laws for basic public goods and services that we might care about, like paid sick leave, municipal broadband, anti-discrimination laws, the minimum wage, and so on. All right, with that, I'm going to throw it over to Khalil, but I also just want to remind folks, or sorry, I didn't state this off the bat, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll take maybe 5 minutes at the end to answer any questions. So Khalil, you're up.
Sounds good. Thank you for that, Jason. Again, for those that I haven't met, my name is Khalil Mans, member of Philly DSA, member of the steering committee in an at-large position. And as Jason said, I'll just be going through some policy points here to discuss Rick and Nikhil's platforms. Alrighty, so on the left, to start off with, one of our endorsed candidates, Nikhil Saval. Just a little bit of background about him. Excuse me. He was a Democratic ward leader, an organizer, and comes from an organizing background, and also is the co-founder of the progressive group Reclaim Philadelphia. He's also done some work with the Bernie Sanders campaign in the past few election cycles, and he's running for the 1st District Senate seat in Philadelphia. His website, for those that haven't gone to it or checked out his policy platform, is nikhilsaval.com. Sorry for not including the link there. And then on the right, we have Rick Krajewski. And the position that he's going for or running for is the state representative in the 188th district in Philadelphia. So it's a very, I guess you can call it gerrymandered sort of map if you saw it, but I believe that includes neighborhoods of Spruce Hill, parts of University City, Cobb's Creek neighborhood. So kind of like West Philadelphia in a sense. And Rick has been an organizer, criminal justice background, and has seen the effects of housing insecurity, the war on drugs, racism, and capitalism firsthand, and decided to do something about it. And his website is rick4westphilly.com. And for both candidates here, they actually released a group COVID-19 recovery platform to address the current crises that we're going through. And there was a lot to this particular platform. I didn't include every single item. These are just some of the, I guess we can call them main pillars of that particular platform. And so to start off with, in true progressive fashion, one thing that you'll notice is that with their recovery platform, it actually links into a lot of the other existing parts of their platform. So nothing is happening in a vacuum here. One of those first pillars is dealing with economic justice and labor, and advocating for support of at least $2,000 a month for families, regardless of immigration status. And the state is able to, or calling for the state to help out if there are any gaps in what the federal government can provide. And they're advocating for, if there's any need for funding for some of this, advocating for a tax on income from wealth. So they've identified a fair share tax plan that comes from the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. And based off of this particular plan, it's calling for an increase in taxes on income from wealth, and it is advocating that it can raise up to $2.2 billion annually to support a progressive program. In addition to that, I don't have it listed on the slide here, but they're also calling for an expansion to unemployment benefits, and also on the labor front, asking companies who wish to receive aid and don't have unionized workforces, asking them to commit to paying workers at least $15 an hour and providing full medical benefits and paid sick leave as a prerequisite for any aid that they receive. The next pillar that we have is the housing for all pillar, and calling for mortgage and rent moratorium. So I feel like we've seen this at the local level as well as the state level. They're just advocating for an extension of anything that's already been there. And this is modeled after an existing Philly plan that they've already identified. And again, with this particular platform, there are a lot more points to it. I just called out some specific ones. So highly recommend that you go to their sites to see them in more detail. In terms of the healthcare front, they're calling for the suspension of medical debt, and urging the Pennsylvania Attorney General to take these steps. And also asking for the establishment of paid care leave of 12 weeks. This is a plan that can guarantee up to 100% of earnings for all workers making 70% or less of the state average weekly wage. And I won't go through any of the details there, but we have the other pillars to this particular platform. And again, just thinking about what I mentioned in the beginning from a progressive standpoint, tying some of the more important issues that are tied with the COVID-19 crisis with the overall progressive agenda. So using this time to reimagine what a green stimulus would look like in Pennsylvania, thinking about mass liberation in the sense of, having plenty of elderly incarcerated individuals that could be at risk still in jail and calling for their release. So there's other aspects that you can look into on their site. Next slide, please. And so separate from the COVID-19 response, these are just some particular points that relate to both Nikhil and Rick's platforms. What we see on the left is primarily Nikhil's, and what we see on the right is Rick's. But I think there certainly is a lot of overlap. So don't feel like they're solely going to be specific to those candidates. In terms of education in the city, they're really calling for a change to our facilities. For those that don't know, there's been a number of stories in the news recently of lead and asbestos in our local schools, not only students being at risk, but also teachers being at risk. And this is the prime time to think about what this could mean from a Green New Deal standpoint. So they're calling for the complete removal of these hazardous materials, and also making sure that going forward, any improvements that are made to these schools are done in a green fashion. In addition to that, they're also calling for thinking of our schools as being community hubs, subsidizing the use of schools to nonprofit and community groups for citizen training as well as mobilization. In terms of the next point there, looking at curriculum and HR, just making sure that we have a commitment to keep public funds and institutions supported with public and unionized employees, and making sure that from a recruitment standpoint, we're hiring underrepresented groups. And the last bullet point there, the freedom budgeting point, there are a lot more specifics in what they're calling for, but one of the big things that I wanted to call out was just the ending of the tax abatement itself. Also, it's not listed on the slide here, but we also see that in this case, Nikhil is calling for the universities to pay their fair share of funding through pilots, which is an acronym, payments in lieu of taxes. And really quickly on the right hand there, we've got a dignified education for all, just simply stating some more broader points in broader parts of the platform. But I think the key takeaway is that we're looking to make sure that we're doing less of the private enterprise, public-private relationships, and focusing on the public aspect. Next slide, please. And really quickly here, wanted to go through some of these housing points. So for those that aren't aware, the city, some of the most recent data shows that 1.5 million Pennsylvanians pay more than 30% of their income on housing. And if anything, that number is probably perhaps double that in terms of what they pay in terms of the proportion of their income. So one of the things that Nikhil is calling for is a goal of 1 million units to build, preserve, and convert public housing. It came up in our previous session that someone had a question about how all of this relates to funding, and can they really call for these sorts of things. And Jason was great with a response that talked about how, you know, a lot of the money for these programs comes from the federal government, but it might be sent to a local housing authority, such as I believe it's the Philadelphia Housing Authority, who manages the property. In terms of the next point there, the renters' rights, just looking to establish statewide rent stabilization and mandate funding for right to counsel in eviction cases for those that might be at risk of eviction. And Jason, next slide, please. And this was something I did that actually I wasn't able to include in the prior presentation, but just wanted to do a little bit of a tail of the tape to compare them to the candidates that they'll be running against. So with Nikhil, we see that we have priorities that are going to be more progressive focused. And the incumbent that he's going up against, Larry Farnese, a traditional Democrat, just more of the broad-based Democratic line. And if we look at that second point about differences in how they plan on, just general growth in Pennsylvania, we see that we've got the same sort of working with nonprofits or small businesses, relying on the same strategy, whereas with Nikhil, we have a strategy that is going to be a lot more bolder than anything that we normally see from this type of incumbent. And in terms of the contributions, we also see a difference in terms of who's actually supporting these candidates. Next slide, please. And for Rick Krajewski and his, technically the incumbent for the 188th, James Roebuck Jr., in terms of the priorities, same thing. We see a difference of having more of a progressive focus and more of a generic Democrat approach. Although with Mr. Roebuck, he is, I believe, the chair of the Education Committee, so has been involved with that for a very long time. From a growth standpoint, he's more along the lines of, public and private partnerships, and even voted for the Republican gerrymandering in 2011. So that is his sort of idea of Republican outreach. In terms of tenure, we see that we have a challenger who has organizing experience and has other experience. In the case of James Roebuck, we see that he's been in office since 1985, and in most cases is either running unopposed in the general or is running in a low turnout race in the primary. And we see that reflected in the next bullet point there, where he won that 2018 primary by 2,080 votes in a district that has a population of around 60,000. So kind of the entire point of this event that we're holding is that, every vote could really make a difference in these types of elections. So the phone banking is going to be really important, so that we have, if we do have a close primary, we see that, candidates like Rick and progressive candidates such as him can actually pull this out. And final slide here, we missed some of these deadlines, but you do have to mail in your ballot for those that have already received it. I just received mine today, by May 26th. And don't forget to sign it as well. In terms of it being valid, I'm not sure how it would be viewed. So just to make sure everything's good and we don't have any issues, just don't forget to sign your ballot. And that's it. Jason, did we have any questions?
Thanks, Khalil. I'm looking in the chat now. We got a couple questions. There's a question from Melanie about why Penn is unique. I assume this is about the education funding. Is that right, Melanie? Okay, great. Yeah, so it's a little complicated how education funding has changed in the last 30 or 40 years, but I would say it's the primary phenomenon is that the state legislature has repeatedly either refused to raise its education funding, sort of with the cost of living or inflation, and has in some instances in particular years actually cut education funding, and then not recovered from that cut for several years or a decade. What that means is that over time, the state has decreased the amount of education funding it's giving to school districts, and school districts have responded somewhat rationally by raising property taxes within their jurisdiction. And because property values are drastically different across the state, some rural areas are incredibly poor and have very low property values, and places like Philadelphia and Reading have relatively low property values compared to the suburbs around them. What that means is that they rely on these, the suburbs rely on the property taxes to keep up funding as the state refuses to fund them. And then municipalities are some of the big urban centers and rural areas are just sort of left to fend for themselves. Philly has actually raised a lot of taxes, a lot of very different types of taxes that are now all under threat. All of those revenue sources are under threat during the COVID lockdown. But the response has been difficult and at times politically tense, as we saw with things like the soda tax. We have another question from Andrew. What is exclusionary zoning? I'll answer this a little bit, but Khalil, feel free to jump in. So this is an old thing from the early 20th century where you could a group of neighbors could come together and sort of like change the zoning for their neighborhood, and they could end up basically instituting a policy where they can exclude certain types of housing stock. Yeah, that's about as much as I know about that. Sorry. Khalil, do you have more to add?
No, I think you kind of summed it up there. I think, of course, the ultimate goal of this is to, exclude certain types of land uses for perhaps, multi-story buildings or something to that effect, where you might say we only prefer, single unit homes. The ultimate goal is, of course, something perhaps a little bit more underhanded. You either want to try and keep out a certain group, or you are doing that for some reason. But yeah, I think it's really just making those types of changes to how the land is used in a given community based off of these zoning ordinances.
Yeah, I think usually it's not specifically like no Black people can move here, but the effect is that Black people cannot move there because most Black people are low income. That's been the effect historically in the sort of mid 20th century. If you have any other questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I think we'll just wait a little bit. There's a question about vote by mail. I am not sure, but Andrew says the official deadline is May 26th, but I would really encourage everyone to fill it out as soon as possible. I mailed mine a few days ago.
Could I quickly add something about that? Because we've been in touch with the campaigns. You're right that the official deadline was the 26th, but they're afraid that people who apply for a mail-in since then will be caught in like a limbo where their application will not be processed in time to mail it out and for the voter to receive it and then mail it back. So if you're on this call and you haven't yet applied for your mail-in ballot, if you feel safe going to a polling place, which I would recommend you look up before you try to go to because it's probably not your normal one, wear PPE and cast your ballot traditionally. That's basically what I can say, but there's like no promises in the city commissioner's office from the 20th, which was yesterday.
Okay, thanks. And looks like we have the votespa.com link in the chat, so feel free to go to that. It looks like there are no further questions, so I'm going to throw it back to Jonah on the canvassing committee to move on to the next portion of the training.
All right. Thanks, Jason. That was great. Thanks, Khalil. Great policy training. The next portion of our training is going to be about organizing, and it's going to be by the canvassing committee. So you've learned what socialists can accomplish with a campaign like Rick and Nikhil's, or if you're involved in one of the campaigns like saving the USPS, which I know the DSA kind of labor committee is really active on. If you're doing any of the campaigning around the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act, which Medicare for All is working on right now, whatever kind of campaigning you're doing, you're going to need to persuade people to join. And that is going to be even trickier now that we can't do it in person. So we are going to go into that. So I will turn it over to Liv, who is going to get us started.
Okay, we are on time, everyone. So I'm going to take a couple minutes now to frame our context for organizing and introduce the way that a conversation works over the phone, basically, as we've been doing phone bankings. But I will say we're trying to have a similar engagement over the phone as we had with in-person door-to-door knocking. So you guys all know that we're here as the DSA, the Philly DSA chapter of a national organization of democratic socialists. And since Bernie dropped out, what we know is since that day, hundreds to thousands of people have joined the National DSA organization. And that includes, at last count, around 70 within the space of a month of membership reports. So there's a lot of people coming in to a democratic socialist movement. I know that it's harder to feel that right now because we're all confined to our houses or to our essential jobs, and there's no rallies anymore except when we're in our cars. But I want to let you guys know that there is that energy there, and people want to put their energy into campaigns for Medicare for All or down ballot candidates, and that's what we're trying to organize, and that's why you're here. And the members of this organization really allow us to do events like this, to publicize them, to pay for Zoom. And so that's the important work our organization is doing. Now, as we just heard for the first section of this event, we have 2 Democratic Socialist down ballot candidates running for the state house. And really big thanks to the policy committee for talking us through what it means to fight for power at the Pennsylvania state level, and what sorts of things like education are major battlegrounds to win demands that can change people's lives from a day-to-day basis, when we talk about the Philly public schools. Now, the other thing that I want to say in regards to this election is that we have no idea what it's going to look like. There's no past data on having an election during a quarantine under a public health crisis. So it could come down to thousands, hundreds, dozens of votes, especially in the West Philly Rick Krajewski race. Last time, again, this historical point doesn't mean that much, but I will say last time the incumbent won by only 2,000 votes or something. We're talking thousands of people voting. So the other thing is that up to 90% of polling places could be closed. We've heard rumors, or we've heard some reports from the city about what polling places are going to be open. But again, we are highly informed voters. Most people might not know about this. So talking to people on the phones about these down ballot races is super important, and could easily get them to decide, oh, hey, I heard somebody from this campaign called me. I recognize the name, sounded good. I'll vote for them. So that's where we are. And I really appreciate everyone being on this call. So keep in mind that every conversation that you have in the next 2 weekends will really count, and consider if you can give 2 hours or 3 hours in the next 2 weekends, because this is it basically. Now I am going to turn it over to a demonstration of a phone banking conversation that we have prepared with 2 members of the canvassing committee who have a lot of phone banking experience, and will show you how a phone bank conversation could go. So you will know what you're looking for. So Jonah and Andrew, go for it.
All right, yeah, so we're going to do a demonstration phone call. I'm going to be the person making the phone call, and Andrew from the canvassing committee is going to be the person at the other end of the line. So let me just get my script up. We have kind of a script that combines the Healthcare Guarantee Act ask with the election ask. So I'm going to kind of do that together. So ring, 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 ring.
Hello?
Hi, is this Andrew?
Yes, this is. Who's this?
Hi, Andrew. My name's Jonah. I'm a volunteer with the Nikhil Saval campaign. How are you holding up?
I'm doing all right. I actually lost my job recently.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you. It's not great.
Yeah, that's a rough situation. You're not alone in this. I'm sure you've seen on the news, millions of people are losing their jobs just like you. That's actually why I'm calling. My organization, Philly DSA, is trying to fight for a just a response to the coronavirus pandemic and to the economic, havoc that's being wrought by it. So have you been keeping up with the stories in the news at all about the relief bills or the stimulus, anything like that?
Not really. I got that check, but that went right to paying bills. It was gone, before I knew it.
Yeah, and have you since you mentioned you lost your job, have you had a chance to apply for unemployment yet? I'm not sure if you know, but you they've expanded the eligibility a great deal, and you'll also get an extra $600 a week.
Oh, great.
So unfortunately, though, the vast majority of the stimulus is going to the billionaires, to the big corporations, people like that, and they're leaving people like us behind. Let me ask you, I am sorry if this is too personal, but were you getting your health care through your employer?
Yes. So when I lost my job, I also lost my health care.
Yeah, there are so many people in the same boat as you. We are trying to raise support right now for a bill that Bernie Sanders has introduced called the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act. Have you heard about that, or heard about Bernie running for president or anything like that?
Yeah, I remember Bernie Sanders running for president, but I haven't heard of this act.
So this bill is kind of, if you were following the race, Bernie was campaigning for Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm.
This would be a step in that direction. So for people like you who lost their employer-provided health insurance, Medicare would cover all of your health insurance costs. It would basically become your insurer. So you wouldn't have to worry about finding a new insurance or going through COBRA or anything like that. You would just be on Medicare for the duration of this crisis. There would be no copays, no deductibles, no premiums. And then also for your friends who maybe are already on a COBRA plan or who have health care but who are worried about the cost, it would cover all copays and like cost sharing stuff for when you go to the doctor. So everyone can get tested for corona, everyone can get treatment during this time. Does that sound like something you'd support?
Yeah, I like I said, I don't have health insurance, and figuring out all this stuff, COBRA and Medicaid, it's all way too complicated, and I'm trying to find a new job. I don't have time to do that stuff. So
yeah, so we have a script that I can send you. We're asking people to call their representative and senators. Would you be willing to do that? It just takes a couple minutes.
Yeah, send me that script.
Great. And then while I have you, we're also our campaign also endorsed, we're also campaigning for someone named Nikhil Saval. He's running for state senate in your district. He's running on a very similar platform to Bernie, kind of supporting the same sort of like, a response to coronavirus that would, work for people like us instead of the wealthy, that would, better funding for education, a better housing situation, Green New Deal. Does that sound like something you might support?
Yeah, but do you think he's going to win? I mean, Bernie didn't win.
That is true, but winning in a state, very centrist Democrat, but I think that people in our district are ready for change. They're ready for something new. We've seen some, strides forward with kind of like-minded people getting elected in Pennsylvania lately. So I think he's got a real shot at it, especially if, people like you and I, get involved and get out and vote for him.
Sure. Yeah. You know what? I think I will vote for him.
Great. Well, I hope you've applied for your vote by mail. It looks like you're in the Black Lodge, so I know that it can be difficult to get out to a polling place from there. So here's the vote by mail link if you need it. Is there anything else I can help with while you're on the phone? I know this is a crazy time.
Yeah. Do you have any light bulbs by chance?
I can mail you some.
Okay, great. No, that's it then.
All right. Well, it was great talking to you. Make sure you vote for Nikhil, and I'll send you the script. And hope you have a good day. Good luck with everything. I'm really sorry that you're dealing with all this.
Thank you. I appreciate it. You have a good day too.
All right. That is the conclusion of the role play. Thank you all. So now we are going to turn it over. Basically, now what we're going to do is take you through the component parts of that conversation. I know that I did it so smoothly and so naturally that you might not have noticed, but I was following along with a script that we have divided up into different sections to try and kind of accomplish different things. So we're going to explain to you what the thinking is behind that, why we do what we do, and hopefully you can take some of this with you. So I think Vicki is going to do the first section.
Hey everyone. So yeah, Jonah mentioned different parts of the script, and any good organizing conversation has a couple of different sections, roughly speaking. And I'm going to be talking about the sort of intro and finding the issue. So this is basically the beginning of the conversation that you're going to be having. And you want to find a person's issue because what you're trying to do is connect the program you're campaigning for or the candidate you're talking to them about to their issues, to the issues that they're dealing with every day. So that way you can offer a solution in the form of that program, whether it's Medicare for All or a candidate like Rick Krajewski or Bernie Sanders. So the way that we do that is to ask questions. The point here is to help the person realize how they feel about this issue before we ask them to ask, because we don't want to just tell them to do something and say, this is the best way to do it. We want to kind of help them get to that realization themselves. And I just want to frame this also by saying a good organizing issue is widely felt, it's something that's deeply felt, it's winnable, and it builds the movement. So normally, when we're campaigning, like when we were campaigning for Bernie Sanders, we had a number of issues like healthcare, housing, education, and workers' rights that we felt out of his platform were the most relevant to people in the area that we were canvassing. But at this time, obviously, coronavirus and the related economic crisis, these are the most important issues facing most Americans and most Philadelphians in our electoral elections. So we're going off of that. Jonah showed everyone one sort of introduction. You don't have to follow it directly, but one way to do that is, if I'm calling someone named Bernie Sanders, I would, after asking if this was Bernie and establishing that it was him, I would say, hi, my name is Vicki. I'm a volunteer with Philly DSA. Depending on how you obtain this person's contact. So if you have internal contacts, you can say, maybe we knocked on your door last year, talking to people about Medicare for All. Or if you're just calling through your van list, you can say, I'm a volunteer, I'm talking to people to see how they're holding up during this pandemic. How have you been doing? And so in this instance, this how you've been doing and mentioning the coronavirus pandemic is a way to sort of, ask them to speak about these issues directly, because most people are feeling a squeeze, whether it's, economically, they lost their job, they know someone who's lost their job, or, they're worried about getting sick, or, they have a parent or a friend who's working in a shitty, low wage job that is, like a grocery worker or something like that. So asking them how they're holding up invites them to share those issues. So when you are, once you ask this sort of introductory question, you want to make sure that you listen more than you talk. And so the general rule of thumb is like a 70% listen, 30% talk. This isn't always possible, but if the person's willing to share with you, you definitely want to listen to them. And you also want to be prepared to sit through an awkward silence if someone isn't willing to open up immediately, or if they need a minute to think about how they're feeling, because some people aren't really talking to that many people in this time. Everyone's sort of isolated. So give them a minute and just sit with the awkward silence. If they're not getting off the phone with you immediately, then you still have an in. And I apologize for the alarm outside my window. But once they've shared their experience or their feelings regarding the pandemic, you can also sort of ask maybe one follow-up question to show that you were listening. Jonah did that in the example with Andrew. Once you've sort of wrapped that piece up, you're going to tell them why you're calling in addition to asking how they're feeling. So, we had been calling through a list of previous contacts we had canvassed for Bernie. So I would have said something like this. So, thank you for sharing. I'm calling today because unfortunately Bernie Sanders has suspended his campaign, but we still need to carry on the fight for issues that are affecting everyone's lives right now, especially making sure that everyone has access to health care. Right now there's a Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act in Congress that will cover everyone's costs throughout the pandemic. Is this something you want your representative to support? So that's a very clear, concise way of tying their issue to the thing that you are calling them about. You can sort of work this in a way that maybe feels more comfortable to you. It doesn't need to be exactly as it would be in the script. And the last thing I briefly want to talk about is, for someone who's maybe not really engaging with you, who's like, I'm fine, when you ask them how they're holding up, or, yeah, everything's fine, I don't know anyone who's affected, or, yeah, this hasn't really bothered me that much. I always ask, do you know anyone who's lost their job, or do you know anyone who's like working in healthcare right now, as a way to sort of remind them that, like, maybe if they themselves aren't the ones who are experiencing issues, they probably know someone who has lost their job, who is working, or who has gotten sick, and maybe couldn't pay their healthcare bills. So it's good to keep in mind that even if someone isn't really experiencing something themselves, you can usually tie it back to someone that they know, and hopefully get them engaged through that. So that's basically all I wanted to cover, and I'm going to pass it over to Handouts, who's going to talk about how to agitate.
Thanks, Vicki. So I don't know if we shared this yet. I'm going to share the link to the script in the chat that we were discussing. I think that's the right one. So people can hear me? Yeah? Yeah, okay, great. So after you found the issue, kind of the next part of the conversation is that you want to, we call it agitating, which is you want to raise some anger and indignation about what's going on. And because there's plenty to be upset about, that's kind of the easier part and the part that comes naturally to us. But you also want to connect that to the political and make sure that people feel a sense of hope at the end of the conversation, and that the issues that they're concerned with can be addressed collectively by the end of the conversation too. So you start with the empathy, and then you move the conversation along through hope and the idea that collective action can actually change things for the better about the things that they're concerned about. So when we're doing this with candidates, it's like much more straightforward because you're trying to link the issues to the candidate's platform or what you're concerned about. But you can also do this when you're not linking it to a specific election issue. If there's, as long as you kind of have an ask to tie it to. So an example I'm going to give to talk about how you would agitate is education. So as Khalil went through, there are plenty of things that are upsetting about Philly's education system that our candidates are trying to change. And after you kind of hear, if you're talking to someone whose kids are in Philly's education system and they're frustrated generally, and particularly frustrated now with whatever kind of support and resources they might be not getting from the system right now, you can empathize with that, but then also ask questions to try to get people to think about that politically. So questions along the lines of, why do you think your schools are poorly funded? Whose interests are being served by how the school system operates? What changes do you want to see in the school system? Having it become a more systemic conversation, and identifying that other people are probably dealing with very similar issues in your community. So in West Philly, this was mentioned by Khalil too, about Penn. when I've canvassed here, but in other parts of Philly too, I talk about Penn's not having this pilot program, which means that Penn has a $15 billion endowment. Its president makes, I think, $3.5 million as a salary a year. And whereas other Ivy Leagues, except for Columbia, have set up these pilot programs to pay their fair share of taxes since they're nonprofits, and they don't pay their fair share. They pay like a small sliver of it. But what Penn does for the community is it sets up 2 schools for their professors' kids to go to so that their professors have education that like suits them to come live in Philly. And so Penn gains a lot, not just in property, but in a lot of other ways from being located in Philly, and doesn't do much as it's an elite, very well-funded educational institution that doesn't really give back to the educational system in Philly at large. And so I'll bring that up when I'm talking to people at the door. That kind of seems to annoy people across the political spectrum, which is a pleasure. And then, but then you want to connect that to political action and offer something good. So as mentioned, Nikhil is aware of this issue, and he also agrees that Penn should pay into a pilot program. And so getting candidates like Nikhil in would maybe make this start to change, or at least try to bring some greater amount of economic equality to the Penn education world and the Philly education world at large. So that's kind of where you want to move the conversation to. One thing I want to emphasize is just that I think with this virus and everything, it becomes very clear that when there's political will, things happen. You know, there's no money until it's politically efficient for there to be the money available. And so our job as organizers is to make our values the things that are politically efficient for politicians to do. And so it's very much just an issue of collective will, and that's why we do this. But that's also why there's a lot of reason to hope if we do our jobs here successfully. Okay, so thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Tyler.
Cool. Thanks, Adas. You can hear me, everybody? All right. So far in the organizing conversation, we've sort of done an introduction, sought to find an issue, and then agitate around that issue. But not every organizing conversation goes quite that smoothly, and not everyone is willing to sort of let you find their issue and jump on board and get upset about something. When we're talking to people, we encounter varying levels of resistance and different disorganizing emotions, which often manifest as things like apathy and hopelessness, so that people basically have been conditioned not to believe that we can win positive change through political actions. And then even worse is, when people have really internalized the justifications for why the system as it is fine, sometimes even saying like pretty grotesque things that you don't want to have to deal with. I would say that these are a minority of cases, but we have to know what to do in this scenario when it's not going as smoothly. And so I think the first thing to do is be glad that you have a chance to talk to this person, because you might be able to change a lot of their beliefs and kind of go against some of that conditioning. And then the next thing to do is to listen really closely. So Vicki already talked about how in the beginning of the conversation, you want to listen more than you talk, and basically give the person a chance to say their concern or to voice their hopelessness or their apathy or whatever it is. So you want to really quiet any inclination you have to get in an argument with them, because as soon as they feel that you're like gonna debate them, you've basically already lost the point of the interaction. Nobody that you're going to be talking to is going to be excited that they feel like the person they're talking to is just like trying to make a point and isn't even listening to what they're saying. So to do this effectively, we have a strategy, an organizing framework called AAR, which stands for Affirm, Answer, and Redirect. And it's basically a way of dealing with difficult questions. And I'm going to post a link that explains in a lot of detail, so that you can have that for later. But again, that stands for affirm, answer, redirect. And what you want to do is first show that you're listening, that you have shared interests with that person, and find something within what they said, even if it's not everything that they said, to affirm. Then you want to answer their question to the best of your ability, and point them to resources if you don't actually have the answer to the question. And finally, redirect to something that furthers the aims of the campaign. So this is basically you're returning to the agitation portion of the conversation after a little diversion. So sometimes that's going to be hard to do because people have internalized very, very bad ideas. But nevertheless, we're going to try to figure out something that we have in common and then kind of pull them in the right direction. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples, and then I'm going to post another link that we'll use as kind of a breakout activity. So one common example that we have to deal with and think about is what happens when people say, how will we pay for any program, but especially Medicare for all, and especially when they just basically assert that it's not possible to pay for it. So let's say somebody says, how will we pay for it? One good way to respond is to say, this is a question that a lot of people ask. And of course, all of us work hard to ensure that our families are able to get healthcare if we do have it. And we can't afford to just take on a bunch of new costs. So we really don't want it to get more expensive, and we're totally on board with you. But a program like Medicare for All will run on progressive taxation, which means that taxes are going to increase only for the richest people, and people like us will actually save money because we won't be paying for premiums, copays, or deductibles. And when we have a system like this, we can actually save a lot of money in money that's not going to the profits of insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies. And then you can, so that's like the answer, and then you can redirect by saying something like, have healthcare costs ever prevented you from doing something that you wanted to do or getting care that you needed to get? And hopefully that kind of brings you back into the frame of asking them to think about, like, what are my current conditions and how could they be better, rather than being so focused on ideas about, like, oh, what's possible and what's impossible. When we go into these breakout rooms, we're gonna use another sheet, which I'm posting now. This sheet has a bunch of examples of different kinds of concerns and problems people will bring up, and they're kind of categorized. So a lot of things that people say will reflect a kind of hopelessness. Some things that people say will reflect different kinds of division. So maybe somebody says, I don't know, it seems like maybe somebody who doesn't work hard enough doesn't deserve to get premium healthcare or whatever. So we have sort of various categories of disorganizing emotions and possible things you might hear while talking to people. And we're going to ask that you try to come up with things that you would say. What would you find in this statement to affirm? How would you answer it? And then how would you redirect? And when we come back, we'll share a couple of examples. All right, I think we're ready for breakout rooms.
Okay, I'll send you guys in.
All right, it looks like everybody is back. So I hope that discussion went well. Now we are going to turn it over. So basically, most of the stuff that we've been talking about, we think has kind of like broad applications, whether you're here in Philly or somewhere else. Basically anywhere. I think that these principles work. But we want to also, we're 2 weeks away from our election, so we want to go into some ways that you can like get involved now. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who's going to go into that. But I just wanted to give a heads up to some of the people who are from out of the city that we're kind of shifting gears to that.
Thanks, Jonah. Yeah, if you're not in Philadelphia, we're definitely not going to be offended if you drop off at this point. If you want to stick around, but it's going to get very, very Philly specific. I am here for two reasons. One is to give another rah-rah speech for getting involved. And two is the more important reason, which is to share with you the Reach app, which we are using to coordinate with voters for Rick Krajewski's and Nikhil Saval's campaign. So in terms of the rah-rah speech, I'll try to keep it simple. One of the things that really motivated me to do Bernie work was just the notion that I wanted to be able to say at the end of the campaign that I did everything I could to get someone elected. And I knew in the back of my head there were going to be tens of millions of people voting. So, like, you know, putting in an effort was important. It's a lot different on such a small scale when the win number for someone like Rick Krajewski could be like 4,000 votes. You can really be looking at yourself on election day wondering whether you could have actually done more to get someone elected. All right, so probably better at showing off apps than giving motivating speeches, but let me go ahead and share my screen.
All right, is this, do you think everyone's back? All right, so thank you all so much to those of you who've stuck it out to the bitter end. We really appreciate it. I hope that you have learned something from this, that you've got something that you can take with you, and most of all, that you're excited to go do political work. There's still a lot of stuff to be done. These next few weeks are going to be incredibly crucial for us, and then certainly going forward, there's still plenty of stuff to do. So just quick reminder, if you have not yet downloaded Reach, do that. Sign up for a phone banking shift. Also, if you want any of the handouts or information that we've given on the presentation emailed to you, please use the form that Vicki dropped in the chat a little while ago. And we'll send that to you afterwards. We're also going to post this video to YouTube, to the Philly DSA YouTube, pretty quickly, probably maybe at some point tonight or early tomorrow. So if you have friends who wanted to come to this but couldn't for whatever reason, you can send them the link and they can watch it if you want to relive the highlights, all the greatest moments of the presentation. We'll have the video up. And then the last thing I want to say is that Philly DSA is still doing a lot of work. We still have a lot of stuff going on, even during the coronavirus crisis. So if you go to phillydsa.org/events, you can see all of the events that we have coming up. In addition to the phone banks that we've been, really hitting you up for, we have a reading group that does readings from Capital Volume 1. And other kind of like Marxist like theory. We're also having a general meeting coming up, but my connection is starting to suck, so I will tap out there. Thank you all again so much. We really appreciate it.
Wait, one quick question. Thank you. So I hope everyone was able to get set up with Rick's Reach app. For those of you who are interested in adding contacts for Nikhil, I just found the contact information from an email for the person you would contact to get that code. So I'm going to paste it into the chat right now. So their name is Tess, and you can either email them or text them to ask for the Reach app code. So instead of, this would be the easiest way to get a hold of their Reach program, okay? So that information's there in the chat. You can do that. It'll take 2 seconds. And then you'll be able to add contacts for Nikhil's campaign as well. That's it. And
that general meeting is happening on June 20th. It's going to be a digital general meeting, so you will not have to go anywhere in person. We'll figure it out so that it happens safely. But that is our next big general membership meeting, and we hope to see you all there. So thanks again so much. Have a great evening. Have a great weekend. And hope you enjoyed this.